Hello again, everyone. My name is Rene Olivieri. I'm the chair of the National Trust, and this session is the case for farming with nature in a changing policy environment. I don't think with this crowd we really need to be talking about the case for, but rather the circumstances that we're living through. Many of you are farmers already, and the product, the service that you provide really is about nature restoration. Others of you recognize that there's no way to have a sustainable, resilient farming business without working with nature rather than against it. Either way, all of us, and we at the National Trust really do recognize this, is that there's no way that nature is going to be restored without the solutions that we need to our farming dilemmas, to our farming problems. The nature and climate crisis lies through the farmland, solving that. Now, the EU era of area-based subsidy payments is now, as we all know, history. It's been replaced by a new system, which is supposed to be public money for public goods. And that raises the question, of course, what those public goods are precisely. And it raises an even more important question, which is how much public money precisely. There's a big problem with trust and transparency here. Successful farming requires long-term planning, long-term investment, as does nature. Farming is a difficult, risky business in the best of circumstances, but the focus and the scale of government funding keeps shifting. As in any other business, uncertainty will lead to underinvestment and suboptimal outcomes for both farmers and for nature. The pause to the Sustainable Farming Incentive Scheme in March left a number of farmers, many farmers, high and dry, and potentially pushes them into the wrong direction, to the opposite direction of more intensive farming in an attempt to create profits which may be illusory, but certainly aren't going to deliver what we need for nature. At the same time, this undermines the efforts and the desires of those who are already on the road towards regenerative farming and want to go further, want to go faster. Today, we're fortunate to have with us a range of farmers and experts who will share with you their views on how they're farming in this volatile environment, how they're making their businesses successful, and perhaps give you a bit of advice along the way. I'm sure many of you know them already. To my right, Helen Browning, CEO of the Soil Association, John Pawsey, an organic farmer, Chris Clark, Nethergill Associates, and Andy Cato of Wild Farmed. So I'm going to jump straight in so that we have plenty of time for questions at the end. I'll try to keep my very enthusiastic panelists to a few short remarks, answer one or two questions, so that we do have maximum time for you to engage at the end of the day. We've only got about 50 minutes altogether, or 45 or 50 minutes, so we'll try to leave about 10, 15 minutes for questions at the end. So get those questions ready, and your best smile for the cameras as well, please. Helen, let's start with you. So you've been in this, you're a farmer yourself, you've run the Soil Association for a number of years. What do you think the challenges are right now for organic farmers?
Well, I think there's all the immediate challenges we've got about the SFI that you've mentioned, Rene, with, it's suddenly stopping, and a lot of, it was the organic conversion grants were moved into SFI last year, having been in countryside stewardship, and then SFI gets closed. So we've really shut the door on organic conversion in the very short term, and that's causing some real problems when we haven't seen any new applicants coming through. And this is at a time when the market is growing really fast for organic food. So it's inevitably going to mean that we end up sucking in imports if that's the case. So I think there's a real immediate problem that we need to solve there. At the same time, if you look back over the last 10 or 15 years, we have all made a lot of progress. Maybe in the organic world, we haven't made as much progress as we'd like compared to a lot of our neighbours around the globe. But actually, when you see the consensus of view around the requirement to farm with nature now, the kind of way that many more farmers are getting on the bandwagon, we've come a long way. And my biggest concern is about maintaining that momentum now, because things are shifting faster than I've ever seen them shift, and we want to kind of keep pushing through because we haven't got much time. So we really need to make sure that we're using public money, private money, any market money to get farmers into the right system as quickly as possible.
So we've heard that there's a new scheme going to come out next year. What would you like to see new or different in that?
Well, I mean, clearly government's thinking that it's going to target that scheme a bit more, which is fine. And I think it's very important to make sure it's those farmers who haven't been able to get hold of that money are going to be eligible. I would be sorry to move away from a universal scheme, something that all farmers can actually access. And I do think that we should be thinking much more about systems and whole farm agreements, and that's where organic really works, rather than just a piecemeal, bits of the jigsaw on a sort of menu type basis. So I think there's some tweaks we could make to it, but I do think that talk of all of the money going into the nature side and not allowing that farming with nature to be supported in the right way would be a real mistake. So I hope they'll get that bit of it right. Thanks.
John, let's go to you as somebody who actually is an organic farmer. Can you actually perhaps draw as well? I know you think of this in a very holistic way. We've mentioned the sustainable farming schemes, but there are other sources of government money, and there are other sources of money as well, private money. Where do you see that all coming together to create a sustainable future for farming?
Gosh, that's a huge question. Where do I see it? Obviously, we have benefited, as Helen has done, through the Sustainable Farming Incentive. And I feel that, for the first time, that the kind of work we've been doing for 25 years has been unfunded, but has quite clearly done a huge amount for nature, because we're doing nature surveys every year, is actually being funded. I've always been very happy to take money from the government for something something that we're delivering that isn't paid for by the market. And so, that has been absolutely fantastic. More recently, I suppose the most exciting thing for us is going into a big landscape recovery project, which is across 20,000 hectares, running from Bury St Edmunds all the way down to the Dedham Vale. And in the first time, as a farmer who's always wanted to do something for nature, this is a chance for us, small farmers, to be joined up and do something really, really fantastic. And all this connectivity that we're hoping to achieve will allow nature to spread across the Suffolk countryside. And no other scheme in the past has given us the opportunity to do that. And we thought it was all going to be about sort of, Brecklands and marshlands and moorlands, but it's in, a part of Suffolk which arguably is denuded of nature. So I'm incredibly excited about that. As far as the other streams of funding, Tom Bradshaw said something very interesting in the opening speech, and he said, look, if we cannot fund landscape recovery with nature-based privately financed payments, where is that money going to be used? And I think he's absolutely right. It's a clear win in terms of connecting our most important habitats, including ancient woodlands, secondary woodlands, ponds, across the Suffolk landscape. The wins are easy, and anybody should be leaping up and down to invest in our project. So anyone in here who wants to invest, please come forward. Sam Hanks is there. He'll take your money. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that pitch. Chris, you've got maybe the most difficult job, because we don't have any graphics here, and you've got a technical thing you're going to try to get across to us, which I have to say, as an economist, I was bowled over. It was a bit of a light bulb moment for me when I read Nethergill's maximum sustainable output work. This idea that actually we're often investing way beyond the point of optimal returns in terms of the profitability, and that maybe there's a point where nature and farming profitability actually come together, which is far different than the equilibrium we've kind of reached at the moment. So give us a good layman's explanation of that. Then talk a bit about where you've put that to use, and also what you think the implications are for the wider countryside.
I think you've done that already.
Okay, great. So we'll move on. No, go back to you, Chris.
My background is farming, but it's also about profitable farming, and I've had the privilege to analyse 373 farm business accounts. And two of the findings that we have from that is that 20% of farm businesses do not cover their variable costs on a pre-support basis. So they're losing cash on every single animal, every single ton of wheat that they send out of the farm gate. Next one, 80% of farm businesses on a pre-support basis do not cover their variable and fixed costs. We have an industry that is embedded in loss-making. And that has been masked, third conclusion, that has been masked by the support system. If we are going to have an effect on policy, it has to start from the ground up. And farmers have to accept that their farm business should be driven to profitable levels that do not rely on support. So how do we get to a position like that? Well, we get to the point of maximum sustainable output. And there are 4 elements to that which have to be grasped, understood, and I'll attempt to do it without any charts. First is that in the UK, we have a managed landscape. It is a landscape that has been developed, evolved to produce food. And nature has kept in tune with that as a step-by-step basis. As farming has changed and increased food production, pre-First World War, really, we're talking about here, then nature has adapted and we've got the things like the wildflower meadows. The second thing that we have to get to grips with is that the food we produce is a fuel. And fuel is energy, and energy is subject to all the laws of physics associated with energy. And so farming is the biggest converter of energy in the UK economy. It is the most important converter of energy in the UK, and yet farming is not seen like that. Third of 4, there are 2 types of energy. There's the solar energy and there's the industrial energy. And farming will have to move to be profitable to maximizing the solar energy in food production, and has to minimize the industrial energy associated with industrial energy inputs like fertilizer and feed. You cannot get more energy out than you put in. So the energy that goes into the manufacture of fertilizer, for example, cannot be recovered in the food that we produce and sell. It is not possible. And when you accept that, fourth and last conclusion is when you have these 2 different types of energy, you have to account for them separately. And when you do that, you find that the energy associated with the industrial energy, fertilizer, feed, non-essential vitamins, etc., that cost line rises faster than the revenue line, and it takes you into loss-making. And that is where we are in the agricultural industry at the moment. We have 14 axioms, and I give you 1. If you compromise, or worse, if you abuse nature, your profitability will decrease.
So, Chris, before we move on from that, what proportion of farms do you think are actually operating at that point? Are you actually saying that almost any use of non-solar energy, and by that you mean basically the crops growing in the sun, not solar panels, are you saying that practically any fossil fuels are not really good to be inputs into farming in this country, that it's negative in terms of profitability?
Industrial energy-based inputs will always have a negative effect. Now, there may well be times when you have to use industrial energy inputs. Speaking to a farmer 2 or 3 days ago, and they have been irrigating spring barley. Okay? Now, if they didn't, they would get nothing. Now, they're going to make a big loss on it, but at least they're going to get something. So there are occasions when you have to, for animal welfare reasons, use non-essential vitamins, for example. And there may be occasions when you have to feed animals because of welfare reasons or other reasons. So, but in general, industrial energy inputs will reduce your profit-making ability.
Yeah. So by extension, you're saying that the vast majority of farms in this country are over-investing in their crops, so to speak.
The policies that have been that farmers have been told to follow have been output-based, yield-based, not profit-based.
Yeah.
You cannot drive yield and achieve more profit when you have 2 different types of energy.
Okay. Well, that's very interesting. Andy, you've farmed you came to farming as an adult. Impressive. You've farmed in 2 different countries successfully. You're really interested in community activity and engagement. You've really kind of revolutionized supply chains. Share some of the lessons with the rest of us here so we can follow your example. Tell us about your experience.
Well, as you say, I came into farming from the outside, came into it very late. And I suppose in terms of the nature question, I ended up having a very humbling few years on a farm in France where the soils were exactly what has just been talked about. We cashed in nature's capital and called it cash. And we've been doing that for a very long time. And I find myself on the sharp end of that without any of the skills required to be a farmer, and that's not a good combination. But when it finally, the phoenix sort of rose from the ashes, a key part of that, and that was because there was still a tradition in that part of France of the paysan boulanger, so the farmer baker. So from the moment that the farm made financial sense, it was direct to consumers. And a part of the direct to consumer appeal was them seeing how we were growing it, which was essentially in nature-rich fields of various different types. So there was the value of nature for the cropping system and the resilience of the crops, but there's also the value of nature as perceived by the customers. And so Wild Farmed was founded on the attempt to bring that to the high street. Not just for those lucky enough to live near a paysan boulanger, but like how can we make this a choice for people on the high street, and how can we try and help farmers to participate in that and join the two things together?
So if you're a relatively small farmer and you're not famous, which some people are, how can you actually make that connection with the consumer, that they will value that product for the nature inputs, for the excitement of it, being involved in this enterprise? How can you make them own that?
Well, it's very hard. Yeah, I mean, I think what we're trying to do specifically in the arable context. Most farmers have got enough on without milling and baking. There's a French phrase which roughly translated means you can't be at the oven and the mill at the same time. And if you try adding a kind of DJ booth in the fields to that, it gets quite wearing, So what we're trying to do is to, through a traceable supply chain, create that link so that arable farmers can eat what they've grown, which itself is quite a radical act. Most arable farmers never get to eat what they've grown. And that has we've found anyway in our community, that has quite a seismic psychological impact on how you want to produce that food in the first place. And on the other hand, if we're saying to consumers, the food system could be, the greatest source of biodiversity recovery, climate stability, health, NHS budgets, and so on, how do they participate if they walk into a supermarket and they have no way of knowing who grew their food and how they grew it? Obviously, at the moment, that apart from the organic foods, that choice doesn't exist.
So tell us a little bit more about the supply chain that you've created and how you've done that, and whether you think that's scalable for others. This going all the way through the chain, and actually, hopefully, as a farmer, getting more value as a result.
Well, there's different bits to the value. I mean, part of that is if you create, the logistics of how you get from field to supermarket shelf or whatever are just very boring and complicated and very expensive if you get them wrong. What we found is that by creating this kind of overarching mission, this joined up chain, we were just walking, Ed, my co-founder, and I walking around yesterday, meeting all kinds of people and realizing just how many people have helped us.
Yeah.
Like, it's amazing, if you go from this starting point of purpose, there's so much yearning for purpose in the world, and people in businesses that you may not expect it from. So many of them have gone the extra yard to actually make these logistics work, and I take my hat off to all of them.
Yeah, and of course that's part of what Groundswell is about, making those connections and feeling part of that larger community and bootstrapping each other, isn't it?
Well, it is, and I think from a value for farmers perspective, part of that is if you've got a link to consumers, then there's value to be had there. It's not easy at all getting it all the way back down the chain, as Helen will testify, because she's been doing similar things with the pigs and the pork and so on. But the other bit of the value is if you know if you knew who grew it and how they grew it, and we can measure its impact. A lot of our focus is similar to the Soil Association Exchange, measuring what happens when you farm in this way. So Bristol University last year were doing the third year of comparisons between conventional fields and wild farm fields, and they found 3.7 times as many bumblebees and twice as the insect biomass. So similar with the water, we've measured the absence of water pollution, so some of our growers are getting direct payments from water companies. So the value jigsaw is going to be made up of all these different things, I think.
That's really interesting. And this measurement thing, I mean, a lot of people I've had conversations with, or everybody's coming up with their own metrics, and everybody realizes you need to be able to prove what you're doing for nature if you want to actually sell that as a public good. I promised we'd have lots of time for questions. I'm going to open it up now. Oh, great, we've got lots of questions. Stand up, please. Say your name. Wait till you get a mic, and smile into the camera. So over here, and then we'll come over here.
Thank you. Sophie Pickering here. I was wondering, in terms of the consumer's willingness to pay for better farm produce, how much do you see that in terms of their willingness to pay that higher price as part of the solution to being able to farm profitably?
Yeah. I'm going to come back to you first, and then I'll come back to you as well. Andy.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different aspects to this. We've got a macro situation, as described earlier, where we're producing food for less than the cost of production, and yet we've got cheap food embedded in society and kind of socially and politically impossible to shift it. So, what do you do about that? But we also live in a world where you pay £7, well, London prices, £7 for a pint, £4.50 for a coffee, and £1 for a loaf of bread. Now, we need to have a little think about the relative value attached to things as well. I think that when you get to loaves of bread or finished products, actually there's a lot of wiggle room in the ingredient price that doesn't have a massive impact on the price of the finished good, because so many of those costs are actually not to do with the original ingredient. So, what we're finding is that we can have a massive impact on price by getting logistics better, and that has much bigger impact on the price of the loaf than the grain price shift.
Yeah, then trying to shift the consumer behavior, you basically change the supply chain.
Yeah, whilst at the same time gently trying to say that, your food choices are your greatest, or can be, if you know who grew them and how. They can be your greatest point of agency in the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, for your health, for your family's health. So making that case as well. We don't have to accept the status quo, but we have to push the status quo in a way that works today, now, so we can keep doing it.
Thank you very much. Helen?
Yeah, I think there's something around the relative price of food that's probably more important than the absolute price. So, we've seen food prices go up a lot. Nobody's saying, my goodness, we've got to go back to 5 years ago, but people are still making decisions on a day-to-day basis against the relative cost of different same category ingredients. Generally, we see with people who are in a position to support better food and farming, and that's not everybody accept, that once prices go above about 20%, that becomes challenging, and that's where market share can start to be withdrawn or withheld. But I think the other big issue, which Andy's touched on, is the economies of scale. I mean, the problem we've got in the organic world is not that actually the premium is at the farm gate. It's the fact that you're dealing with small amounts of food going through the system, all having to be handled and kept separate. And that means that you're very inefficient from farm through to the consumer. And one of the breakthroughs that many other countries have made is to say, let's get volume going through the system. Let's make sure we've got organic in public procurement and these kind of things. Prime the markets so that you can get some economies of scale. And that will make a massive difference to the price at the consumer end of things. So, yeah.
Thanks for that. Should we move on? John, did you want to say anything about this, or should we move on to the next question? Yeah, it's very interesting. If groundswell is anything to go by, we might get that scale at some point, if that's really what's happening. And then, of course, the average price, the average unit cost should come down, the cost of the consumer comes down, and you get the best of both worlds. That would be the ideal scenario. Right here, please, in the blue shirt.
Hi there, Bill Thickness. General question for the panel. How do you get the regen message across effectively to the consumers in the supermarket? What was the best way of messaging that is a receptive way for consumers to enjoy? And is it anything to do with nutrient density, which I've heard a bit about here? I'd like to hear a bit more about.
Anything further? I mean, I guess it's somewhat similar to the question we just had. Do you have anything further to add on this?
It's really hard. Most people haven't heard of the word regenerative, which we forget while we're here, but most people haven't. By far, the vast majority of people haven't. So I think it's, well, from our perspective, it's like, rather than labouring that, it's like, but you are interested in birds and bees and the Attenborough programme, all the abundance of the Attenborough programme that you love is actually based on how we produce food, or largely how we produce food, rivers that we can swim in, an abundant future for your kids, your family's health, all this stuff. All of our consumer-facing research indicates that when it comes to the crunch, health is the key thing. And that leads to a whole world of pain about what you can and can't say on packaging according to the Advertising Standards Agency. And in terms of the nutrient density point, again, we're doing lots of work on that to analyse not just the grain, but what happens once it's gone through to the loaf. And the research linking soil health, plant health, human health is, more than a century old. There's no news here, but it's kind of making that work within a supply chain and working out what happens actually in the finished product rather than in the grain itself. And again, according to the rules of the game, what you can say and what you can't say.
And just to reinforce that we've had a very regenerative form of agriculture in organic around for a very long time, which does have a real understanding at the consumer level. And I think that is something we just really need to build on. It's really exciting that a lot of young consumers are coming into organic now as well. So at one time we thought it was all about old people who were thinking about how their food used to be produced.
It does feel. While you say that?
I know. I'm putting it me. So it's kind of fun. It's interesting that there's a new generation coming through who actually really get it.
You see it here as well too.
Can I just John? I want to ask Helen and Andy a question actually, because actually I think what's really interesting about the organic thing is that actually we've stayed at 3%. The organic market is growing, but in terms of conversions in the UK, organic has stayed at 3%, and one could argue that actually that's a failure in the organic system. So it'd be really interesting to know, what you've learned from that journey, Andy, and maybe Helen. I think it'd be really interesting to hear your comment on that.
What I've learnt about
why organic hasn't actually, got beyond 3%.
Yeah, I mean, all I can comment on is my own personal experience, and so I farmed organically in France all the way through there, and then when I came back to the UK, started doing the wild farm thing, and then as my knowledge of different things expanded, notably around SAP testing, which is basically sort of, for the non-farmers in the room, kind of blood tests for plants, nutrition based on need. And working with more and more farmers who were trying to move from a 12 pesticide, 300 kilos of nitrogen milling wheat system to something quite radically different. And how can we make this mindset shift work in a way which is actually doable and achievable? And one of the first steps away from the organic standards for me was just seeing that even if you've done everything right, you've built your fertility in a herbal layer over 4 years, and you turn it upside down to have your bumper kind of first cereal crop, and then the spring's too wet or the spring's too cold, and the nitrogen supply from the soil biology isn't there, and so you lose kind of photosynthetic potential from the crop, and then people might abandon it. And then if we put 40 kilos of nitrogen on there to keep the show on the road, capture a bit more sunlight, then they wouldn't abandon it. So it's just trying to find this sweet spot where we can meet the world as it is and try and shift as many people towards what we all want, which is basically food production based on biology rather than chemistry, which is what you were saying at the beginning.
Yeah. Can we get a question over here and then over here, and then I'll come back to there.
David Harding. It's really for Helen and John. As fellow organic farmers, do you find that there is a difference with regenerative and organic in the sense of how we best farm with nature? Do you think there is a difference, or should we collaborate and there is no difference?
John, you want to answer this?
The reason why I got into organic farming is I wanted to find a profitable way of doing the kind of farming that I felt that I needed to do to be responsible to our land, but also our growing of crops, but also what nature did on the farm. And so ours was about increasing soil health and providing more for nature. And organic at the time provided with that economic model because actually we did get paid more for the crops that we produced. And so as far as I'm concerned, any system, and funny enough, I don't see it as a competition between organic and regenerative. I think actually what we want to be on a journey, we all want to be on a journey, and that might be organic for some people and it might be regenerative for other people. And so if we are increasing soil health and we have more wildlife on our farms, I don't care what system it is, I'm going to be behind it. So I think the regenerative movement is incredibly exciting. I have to applaud Andy for bringing in a set of standards to their regenerative farming model, because I think it's very confusing. With organic, you have a legal set of standards that anyone can pick up and read, and they know exactly what we can and we can't do. In regenerative, that's not the case, but Andy's got a set of standards. But as Helen once said at Groundswell, is that if you bring in standards now, you will kill the fire in people's bellies. And I think it's very important to say, you know, we're wanting this positive trajectory, and I think, you know, the regenerative, organic, whatever you want to call it, takes us on that trajectory, and we should applaud it.
There's a lady back here with the glasses who's had her hand up, and another lady here. Thank you.
Wildlife Trust tent is the place to be. Hey. I'm Sophia Parente. I'm from WWF. I'm really happy to hear speakers talk about nutrition alongside regenerative farming. We do have legally binding targets for biodiversity and for climate, but no such targets for nutrition security. And it's not just self-sufficiency or food security, it's nutrition security. Is the food we should be eating for a healthy population. So do you think we need a mechanism to make sure that we're reaching all these different goals? Because there's lots of synergies, there's also trade-offs between them. We have a lot of policy consultations going on, but my fear is that they will end up being guidance, government policy, which can be overturned. So do we need something new to make sure we're reaching all these goals?
Yeah, Dimbleby tried to look at this holistically. Do we up here think that that's a hiding to nothing, with government focused on so many other things, to wrap nutrition targets or regulatory environment into all of this? Or do you think that overcomplicates it or makes the case stronger? Who wants to answer that? Helen. Helen, and then I'll come back.
I think one of the areas where you can make progress is to reduce the consumption of ultra-processed foods and increase the consumption of fresh food. And that's, that sounds simple, it's not. But that's where I think governments can be focused initially if you're trying to improve nutritional security. And there's lots to do around nutritional density and all sorts of things. But let's get people off the junk and onto some better stuff.
Chris.
Very important to get the nutrition right, but we can't get nutrition right if farmers aren't profitable. It's a broken record as far as I'm concerned. I say it all the time, but we can talk about policy, we can talk about nutrition, we can talk about breeds of sheep or cattle, but until the farming industry is inherently profitable, we can't do any of these things.
Yeah. Here, and then come back to you in the corner.
So my name's Emily Williams. I was wondering what the panel's thoughts are on the comparison between different countries' populations and farmers' attitudes to more positive farming techniques, and what we can learn from each other, as well as their engagement in kind of ancillary products like charcoals and wild food like venison, etc.
So what's happening in other countries that we could easily emulate or learn from? I'll come to you, Andy, because you've been in another country.
Well, I mean, I'm actually nothing to do with France, but I was reading some stuff recently whereby historically, countries where you have a high population, limited land, you ended up with these largely manual labour-orientated food systems, so it's incredibly fertile, Javan terraces or Chinese vegetable gardens or whatever, that were fertile for centuries and centuries and centuries. And when you had countries where there was more land and fewer people, you ended up with large mechanised operations which exhausted the fertility of that land much more quickly. So we go to the Dust Bowl in 20 years kind of thing. So I think where you've got this contrast between the available population and the amount of land, you've had these different cultures. So it's like, how can we apply the principles that were making those gardens and those terraces fertile for 4,000 years to the large mechanised systems that we've got, and essentially it comes down to harvesting sunshine. Chris was talking about keeping the soil covered with a diversity of plants for the greatest possible time.
Thanks. Can move. I just want to get as many other questions as we can. This chap here, and then there was a lady in the front here.
Sorry, I was just trying to work out how to say this question, but Chris, it was really to your point. So solar energy, great, it's awesome that you can use it, but it's probably a longer term transition. That is the regenerative journey. How do you get conventional farmers, where the easy option is to do that industrial thing, it is to get the bigger equipment, it is to put more chemicals on, how do you get them to come along on the journey? And I suppose that the underlying thing is you can't be green if you're in the red. How do you actually ensure that that's a nature-friendly form of farming?
80% of farm businesses do not cover their fixed and variable costs before support. We're already seeing plenty of farms change their approach because they will not be able to be profitable without support. And so if they don't do it willingly, they're going to be forced into it as support goes down. And that's just a fact.
So you're saying the economics is going to make it happen?
Economics will make it happen. But what will happen is that farms will aggregate and farms will get bigger. And actually, we don't want to see that as a country. We want to keep the farmers there. So we really want to encourage, through policy, through support, to keep farmers moving towards what we would call maximum sustainable output, or a regenerative approach. Do you want to take the mic?
Yeah, the question is just how do you achieve that when policy is so uncertain? And I think that's basically the dilemma we're talking about here today, and why we need a new paradigm that everybody can get behind, the farming community, the larger community, the world around there, but also the politicians clearly as well, and the civil servants.
But I think the first thing you have to realize is that government is not the solution. It's the problem. We have to take control as a farming industry of our own businesses. At the end of the day, we are first and foremost in business.
Yeah,
that's what
we need to understand what drives profitability better.
Indeed.
Yeah. Here, questions here? Comment? Please.
Thank you very much. Just actually, you've kind of answered my question, which was, what forms of support are acceptable in an MSO context? So you've distinguished support which masks profitability, but evidently you've also spoken about support which is important for transition. So could you distinguish between the two, please?
I'll do my best, Anita.
Thank you.
Let's try and understand what support is for. Is support there to get a farm to break even? Or is support there to get a farm to break even and pay that farm a living wage? Or is support there to maximise natural capital, and if they do that, then profitability will inevitably increase if you're not abusing or compromising nature. So it is that third element about paying farmers to improve natural capital. Moving to the sweet spot, the point of maximum sustainable output, is where support, in my view, should be concentrated right now. I am less enamored with a payment for public goods, heretical probably, and more enamored with profitability of farms.
Yeah, because you think that will automatically move to lower bad inputs.
We're already seeing farms that have moved to MSO see an increase in their biodiversity. And they have done no measurement, no soil testing, no carbon calculators. It just happens because you're farming in equilibrium with nature, working with it rather than substituting for it.
Thank you. Question here?
It's perhaps already been sort of mentioned that maybe farmers should be doing this outside of policy. You know, why wait for policy to change? But in that case, how do we empower the individual farmers to actually make the change and to actually step forward and do what needs to be done? And who drives that? Is it the industry that drives it? Is it consumers? You know, if we're trying to do it outside of the actual policy, how do we empower farmers to do that?
John, what do you think about that question?
Well, I mean, I think that yes, it's a difficult one. I mean, there will be always farmers who are going to do that anyway. And I would probably say that we were one of those farmers. But how do you drive it? The thing about the sustainable farming incentive, it was an incentive, and to me it suggested not a particularly long-term solution, but it was a kickstart of getting farmers across that period of maybe organic conversion, or the 5 years supposedly when you're a regenerative farmer of getting into a state when your soils are acting as they should, and so your yields start going up, and there's this sort of dip, and then so I support that kick-starting of a different way of farming, and so that's why I think it's very important that actually it had just been kick-started. People around me who I never thought would change were beginning to change, and I just think we need another short period of time to continue with that support, and then actually probably at that point when our soils are acting and hopefully we're going to be in a profitable situation, then we can look at something else.
Question back here.
Probably mainly for Chris, but interested what other people think as well. Chris, you talked about the limitations of industrial inputs going into the system for profitability. But what's the role of other inputs, thinking about sort of genetics and either technological stuff, but conventional breeding processes and those sorts of things, solar power, nuclear power? There's a lot of other technological stuff that can feed into a system, and the appropriate role for that within your model or more generally in this move across in this
Thanks.
transition.
Very good question, Chris. What do you think?
So, 370 odd farms, 100 and something data points on each farm. The least profitable livestock business is all sheep. The next least profitable is all beef. The most profitable is beef and sheep with a ratio 60% beef LSUs to 40% sheep. Break that one down, and the most profitable farms are those that have native breed animals with no genetic improvement.
And what about technology other than that? What could small farms be doing now to deploy technology to find the sweet spot or to actually operate more efficiently?
If that technology is based around machinery that lies in the nettles or in the barn for 9 months, 10 months, 11 months of the year, I'm not sure how that works.
Yeah, good response. Andy?
I agree on the machinery, having been on the wrong end of that several times over the years, but I do think that there is a very exciting role for technology in allowing us to move from a farming system based on the suppression of nature to a farming system that's in a collaboration with nature. And that would be, for example, sap testing is a fantastic example of a technology that allows us to change how we manage things. And I also think, for us anyway, the key role of technology is in outcomes measurement. So measuring what's actually happening, because the organic movement have basically kept the lights on for 70 years. It's based on practices. It's only 3%. We want more people to go down exactly the same road, taking different paths. How do we quantify all this without getting into a nightmarish sea of different certifications? Let's just measure the outcomes. And so, to give one example of that, with our nature monitoring, we've been using pan traps. Bristol University, and the students count the insects and they identify them and all the rest of it. And this year we're correlating the pan traps with these AI listening devices that can differentiate between the sound of different insects' wing beats. So you get that working, and a farmer puts that in their field, and then you've got scalable outcomes measurement, and that unlocks payments, it unlocks profitability, it unlocks knowing where your sweet spot is, it unlocks changing tenancies, like some of the work we're speaking to the National Trust about how you build tenancies around the idea of building natural capital rather than being extractive. Once you've got this data, it unlocks all of that. So I think technology is key there.
Really. Helen, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I just really back that. Environmental monitoring, I think, is going to be a really big part of the mix.
Right. I've got one more question here, and then I have the final question.
Hi, Helen Bynum. Where does waste fit into the sweet spot?
Oh, good question. Good question. Who wants to answer that? I think that sweet spot is for you, and then I'll come to you, John. The waste.
If it's waste, we consider it as a byproduct. It fits in there perfectly. Talking to somebody here yesterday, taking beans, soaking them, waste beans, unusable in the industry, taking waste beans, soaking them, feeding them to pigs. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Fits in really well.
John, you have anything?
I've really got nothing to say. I mean, we waste nothing. I mean, we really don't. You know, I mean, I eat everything on my plate. We have a
good boy. John.
We have a piggy pail, which is now illegal, but who cares? So nothing goes to waste.
I think it's really interesting that some of the things that society calls waste are in our kind of farming systems the raw material of the, you know, that circularity. So I think there's no doubt that, you know, as a society we do waste a lot of stuff though, and if we can nail that down a bit more, then it really does reduce the pressure on agriculture to keep producing more food. I mean, we have got into a ridiculous situation where there's massive overproduction, massive waste, and we're on that sort of hamster wheel that we've got to get off. So just as in other sectors we're looking at reusing, recycling, not using in the first place, we need to be thinking about that on the food side too, whilst keeping a bit of fat in the system, because there is a need to make sure that you've got enough redundancy in the system to cope with shocks. And I think that's something we don't always think about in the food system. We just, you know, we've got so used to the just-in-time, mustn't waste a thing. We've got to have some fat in there somewhere for the lean years.
Great, thank you. So my final question is for you, Andy. Are you going to convert Jeremy Clarkson to regenerative farming or not? Come on, get on with it. You don't have to answer this question, but you can answer this question if you'd like. Right, I think that wraps it up for today, folks.
No, I think that without putting words in his mouth, but putting words in his mouth, you know, I've yet to meet any farmer who wouldn't choose to grow quality food in nature-rich landscapes if they had the choice of doing so.
Hear, hear. This is a very small tent. You've been a very big and hot audience. We'll let you go out into the freedom of the outside again. Thank you very much for coming. It's been a really good session. Thank you. Thank you.